About 10 years ago, I proposed an interpretation of Cyril Methodius' activity based on a missionary project developed at the time of Patriarch Photius after the triumph of Iconodulia in the context of a cultural renewal that marked the Byzantine Empire in the second half of the 9th century. Behind the biographical events of the protagonist of this extravagant season, which marked the entry of the Balkan and the Danubian Slavic world into the Eastern Christian tradition, scholars generally focus on the invention of alphabets and the birth of the Slavonic writing tradition. The question of the context and forms of the message underlying this missionary activity as remained marginal. At most, some theological concepts and canonical practices emerged, which were the subject of diatribes between East and West in the following centuries, beginning with the question of the filioque, mostly in relation to the famous Phocian shift. I've chosen instead to study the content and form of the message in the context of the Eastern Christian tradition, highlighting the differences with the Western tradition, which since the time of Augustine and Gregory the Greek have developed a different common approach. On this occasion, I will attempt to highlight the common strategy of the Thessalonian brothers, considering the rhetorical forms adopted within the context of the Constantinopolitan tradition of the time of Photius. In my opinion, the prologue to the Gospel is a text which, although only present in late testimonies, clearly express the thinking of Constantine Cyril, who, according to authoritative scholars, may be its author. The prologue is composed in iambic trimetres, a traditional verse from form of Byzantine hymnography, which dates back to Greek tragedy. Unable to adopt vowel quantity in Slavonic, the author opts for isosyllables. The verses are made up of 12 syllables, with an internal division in two parts of 7 and 5 syllables. Despite its short length, just over 100 verses, the composition consistently illustrates the meaning of the written word as conveyed by the Gospels. Several reconstruction has been made based on the 4 witnesses, the best known of which belongs to Rhetorical. There are several versions in modern languages, including Maya and Italian, but among this, I would like to mention English translation of Ronan Jacobson in a short study to which I will return. This is a speech delivered in the first person by the prologue, using the rhetorical figure of prosopopoeia, in which the Christian message is illustrated and summarized as follows. The gospel is, quote, light for the whole world, and its proclamation is destined to heal the sense of man. The blind shall see, the deaf shall hear. This message is a divine gift contained in a written word of the 4 evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, who teach all people the message of the liberation of mankind. To interpret the meaning of these states correctly, one must consider the repeated call to listen to the word, which contains a similitude of the word as nourishment and refers explicitly to the mind and heart of man. It is therefore not a question of physical healing, but naturally of an inner transformation of man. To explain the action of the word more precisely, the author adopts a series of rhetorical forms, especially metaphors, which focus on the different senses, from sight to hearing, from smell to taste. First, he refers to blindness, which makes it possible to perceive the beauty of creation as is compared to the soul without letter, which does not know the divine law, the law of whispering books, the law that the divine paradise manifests. Secondly, he speaks of deafness, which makes it impossible to hear the thunderous thunder which opens man's ear to the fear of God. Then it recalls the absence of smell, which deprives one of the perception of scent of flowers, alluding to the divine wonder of the perception of the word. A thinly veiled allusion to Paul's metaphor of the fragrance of Christ in the second letter to Corinthians. Finally, it refers to the absence of taste, quote, which turns mind into the stone, an image of the insensitive, of the unlettered soul, which is in fact dead, murder. All human senses are therefore subject to a process of metaphorization, in which sensory experience represents the starting point for a spiritual life announced in the gospel message, containing the sacred books and aimed at the transformation of man. In the exhortation of the Prologue, accepting is the advice means abandoning the bestial and lustful states like linked solely to sensory experience. This is a perspective from which the reference to the passage from the first letter to the Corinthians, which can also be read in the life of Constantine in the 16th chapter. According to the Prologue, the man who opens his mind is no longer destined to hear a word in a foreign language as you heard the sound of a bronze bell. Referring to 1 Corinthians letter, he explains the teaching as follows. I lift up my prayer before God, for I prefer to say 5 words that all the brethren may understand, rather than 1,000 words that are not understood. For what man will not understand? Who will not echo the wise parable which sets forth true discourse, Prologue, mondo. With this word, therefore, the author develops and deepens his interpretation of the passage from Paul's letter containing in the life of Constantine series, which serves not only, this is important, to justify the translation of liturgical books into Slavonic, beginning with the Holy Scriptures, but also to illustrate the purpose of this complex and delicate operation. Thanks to this translation, it is possible to draw directly on the Christian message, which consists in applying the wise parable, capable of transmitting the truth. Jacobson understood the centrality of this idea and, quoting the life of Clement, believed that, quote, the meaning, I quote Jacobson, the meaning of scripture and Slavicide liturgy as a means for an intelligent being to overcome to unintelligible is precisely the main theme of the word. To convey this idea, another method of use, nourishment of the body, which helps to keep it alive, is compared to the word that nourishes the soul, a metaphor also present in another passage, first letter to Corinthians. Drawing directly from the Gospel, the author presents a parable of the seed in the field, Prologue mondo, but offers his own exegesis, in which the field represents human earth, and the rain becomes the divine rain of letters necessary for diving through it to grow more abundantly. As we can see, books became the fundamental tool for illustrating the gospel message in an understandable, meaningful way, and people who don't possess and cannot defend themselves against evil. For without books, the nation are naked. See the text. Unable to fight without weapons against the adversary of our souls, really to the captivity of eternal punishment. The comparison of the book as a weapon introduces the biblical metaphor of combat, which is present again in Paul's Paul, this time in the second letter to the Corinthians. The new metaphor is aimed at a renewed exhortation of the Prologue. Open the doors of your mind with care, emphasizing that these solid weapons are forged from the books of the Lord. Even after victory of the enemy in the aftermath of the final judgment, believers are designed to glorify the merciful with the songs of the books from. This poetic composition in Slavic of exquisite workmanship, perhaps the oldest if we exclude the alphabetical acrostic with the name of glagolitic letters, bears witness to the process of acculturation of the Slavs achieved by adopting the community strategy of the Byzantine tradition, in which the stratification resulting from the fusion of the elements of Hellenist culture and Judeo-Christian heritage is manifest. Jacobson believes that Constantine Cyril was not only the author, but that he initially composed it in Greek and then translated it into Slavonic. The use of rhetorical forms from the initial personification to the various devices employed appears to be aimed at illustrating the fundamental concept of the gospel message. Sacred books play a fundamental role in the process of evangelization, recalling the centrality of books in the literary civilization of the classical Mediterranean and Judeo-Christian world. The horizon of a complex sensory experience inevitably recalls liturgical celebration, evoking the sacramental practice in a mystagogical key of the Eastern Christian tradition with its religious. The same approach to the metaphorization of sensory perception could be followed, in fact, in the celebration of Mass. The gospel message contained in the Holy Scripture is primarily a process of transformation of human mind, nous, but its communication is linked to forms of communication already present in the catechesis of the early centuries and in patristic vision. To understand this aspect more deeply, reference should be made to the various catechetical and apologetic discourse of Constantine Cyril found in his life. But I cannot name now all this, explain all these discourses. Here I will limit myself to pointing out a passage from chapter 16 of his life, which we have already quoted, and which is found before the passage from the first letter to the Corinthians. This passage contains several quotations from the Gospel that focus on the question of knowledge of the Gospel message and its correct interpretation, referring Jesus' criticism to the Pharisees with mention of the concept of the key of knowledge, ключ разумения. And you see the quotation. To illustrate the approach of the Thessalonian brothers to the question, we can also consider a passage from the Gospels in the Slavonic version, which according to the tradition dates back to Constantine Cyril. In the episode of Jesus' appearance to the disciples of Amos, the translator faithfully, following the Greek text, the NX and ton nun, translates od verse it is that he opened the minds of the disciples. Comparing this translation with traditional Latin version of the Vulgate, in which we read the expression aperuit sensum, we can observe a different hermeneutic orientation. The Slavonic translator's attention is focused more on the interpreting subject and the need to open up to the message, while the Latin version focuses on the object, the interpretation, and therefore the exegetical. These different translations reveal different concepts, in which in some respects is the legacy of the Byzantine Slavonic East and the Latin West. However, this approach does not exempt us from the careful use of formal communication, which were part of the training of Slavic clergy during the Cyrillo-Methodian era, as evidenced by the complete patristic translations produced mainly in the Old Bulgarian period. The first theoretical illustration of the fundamental concepts and rhetorical forms of the Christian message can be read in Slavic in Simeon Marcello, the oldest manuscript evidence of which is born in 1073. As we have pointed out in the past, this first Slavic miscellany produced at the court of Tsar Simeon at the beginning of the 10th century derives from a Greek original text called Soterius, an anthology conceived in the Constantine court at the time of Phocius, when the young Simeon was held hostage in Constantinople, received an education that made him a semi-Greek. In recent years, I saw that demonstrate that the Greek original and its Slavonic version are not simply a treatise of Christian scholarship in encyclopedic form, as the work has often been presented, but are intended to offer a series of exegetical tools necessary for understanding the whole scripture, both in terms of content and form. Examining the structure of the Simeon's miscellany, it can be said that its purpose is to expound extra-Christian doctrine with a specific focus on the formation of the laity through an interpretation of specific passages of the Holy Scriptures in the light of patristic exegesis. And you see the title in the Slavonic version with an English translation. The miscellany of my father and son. The translator's interest was there focused on concepts that were difficult to understand in the Holy Scripture. This question is explicitly addressed in the colophon of Simeon's miscellany, which is generally referred to as Encomium of Tsar Simeon, to which I have dedicated specific studies. And you see the English translation of Francis Thompson. Considering the solid core consisting of 88 questions, it can be said that the material offered by Anastasius Sinaitis' question on spiritual life, especially that of enlightenment, has been used and reorganized with a series of new questions attributed to the pseudo-Anastasius, which refer first to the Old Testament and then to the New Testament, where the distinction between the apostolic letters and the Gospels clearly emerges. The solid order based on the Holy Scriptures allows not only to experience the unity of the Old and New Testament on the basis of historical and allegorical interpretation, but also to follow the chronological development of history of salvation. Reference should be made to one of the central questions in Simeon's miscellany, question 75, meaning Patrologia Greca 65, which deals with exegesis of Matthew 13:52, on the scribe who became a disciple of the kingdom of heaven and to which we have devoted data analysis. This valuable collection of quotations from Holy Scriptures and the Church Fathers, composed by an anonymous author, that's been pseudo-Anastasius, in the time of Phocius, constitutes not only a true apology of the Holy Scriptures as a testimony of divine wisdom, as opposed to pagan wisdom, but also a meaningful reflection on its linguistic and oratorical formulation. On the basis of detailed analysis, it could rightly be included among the testimonies of the Syro-Methodian question, and perhaps among the major source of inspiration of the work of the brothers of Thessaloniki. This is demonstrated first and foremost by the centrality of the motive of speaking in tongues and 1,000 words interpreted as teaching how to express oneself in unstable words capable of communicating divine wisdom, an idea that undoubtedly represents the missing link between Pauline reflection and its concrete application to the situation of the Church in morality, when Constantine Syriac undertook to introduce Slavonic in the liturgy. In the same Simeon's miscellany, within the long collection of basic passage in the first section before the individual question and answer, we can also read the passage from John Chrysostom's commentary of the first letter of Corinthians, in which Constantine the Patriarch considers the different sense in relation to the specific characteristic in the discourse on the relationship between Christian faith and philosophical reason. And finally, I would like to mention the final section of Siemens' Miscellany is devoted to series of interpretive tools with an in-depth analysis of rhetorical forms. This anthological section begins with a short treatise by Theodore of Rhetorical on the fundamental concept of latent Christological debate, which are essential for understanding the Constantinopolitan symbol, nature, substance, person, and so on. This is followed by excerpts, this is very important, from George Chiroboscus' treatise on tropes, which are, as Francis Thompson said, a guide to the correct interpretation of the figurative language of the Holy Scripture, essential reflections on the use of allegory, and finally, a collection of short extracts on the Trinitarian doctrine by authoritative father from both the East, Gregory of Nazianzus, Basil, and the West, Irenaeus and Augustine. I must say that a selection of passages of Chiroboscus excludes all examples taken from pagan classics, retaining only biblical examples. This short collection contains errors and misunderstandings in translation that show the difficulty at that time, at the beginning of the 10th century, of bridging the gap between cultures and confirm the pioneer nature of the undertaking of translation. These passages are followed by very brief reflection by Epiphanius of Salamis on the use of allegory in the Holy Scripture. I must say that the reflection of Epiphanius Salamis don't seem to come directly from Epiphanius' panel, as the text is right, and are perhaps only a paraphrase of it. In conclusion, our brief analysis of the progress communication strategy has allowed us to present some fundamental metaphors and similitudes from the Cyrillo-Methodian tradition, linked to the sensory experience which originated the Gospels and Pauline exegesis, especially in the letters to the Corinthians. These metaphors and similitudes, like the parables, were fundamental tools for communicating the gospel message and were intended to educate the newly converted peoples in the spiritual life to which they were to respond. This laid the foundations for developing a sensitivity to the profound meaning present in the Holy Scripture in a wisdom-based conception that had characterized the patristic and monastic tradition. I would like also, there is some other consideration that I can say, but I think that is enough.